Let me tell you what it's like to grow up as the forgotten child. My name is Audrey, and I have an older sister named Samantha. She's 2 years older than me. And honestly, sometimes it felt like she was the only child in our family. All the attention, all the care, everything was for her. Samantha was always the center of the world for my parents. She got new things, and I got her old ones. It didn't seem like we were poor or anything like that, although sometimes, looking at our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were always somehow in the shadow of her light. When Samantha upgraded her phone, I got her old one. When she outgrew her shoes, I inherited her worn-out and slightly misshapen sneakers. Her laptop, the one she spent nights on doing homework and endless chats, became mine when she bought herself a new one. And in all those things, already no longer new, I felt a certain air of neglect, as if I was something secondary, something left over for later. But I didn't complain, I didn't say anything out loud, because in our house, there was no room for complaints and silence became my norm. My parents, they just didn't think I needed my own things. Everything that belonged to Samantha was good enough for me. It wasn't bad treatment, more like I saw it as their way of showing love. They didn't pay attention to the fact that I was left in the shadows. I didn't know what I actually needed, or that I would like something of my own, something new, not something that had been used by someone else before me. I didn't even ask. I didn't know how to ask. Everything was somehow assumed, with no particular regard for my desires. But there was one person in our family who saw what was going on. It was my grandmother, my mother's mom. She was the only one who noticed my side of life, its quiet but bright side. Her face always wore a special expression when she saw me being handed something that had long since stopped being new and beautiful. She never spoke about it loudly, but I could always see her gaze, full of sadness and understanding. One day, when my parents got caught up in their conversation and Samantha disappeared into her room, my grandmother came up to me. She looked at me, as always, with that expression as if her heart had clenched with pain, holding back tears. My grandmother was a wise woman, with a soft but firm hand and a soul that saw more than anyone else in our family. "Come here, dear," she said, leading me to the corner of the kitchen, where it was warm and smelled of bread. I looked at her, and her eyes filled with the very care I had been missing. She handed me an envelope, and I immediately understood that it wasn't just money. It was her way of telling me something my parents hadn't said. Buy yourself something nice, okay? Something that belongs only to you. I took the envelope, not immediately understanding what to do with it. I had gotten so used to not needing to ask for anything, everything had already been decided for me. But my grandmother always knew I wasn't like Samantha, and she didn't try to compare us. She saw me, not as a pitiful addition, but as an individual. A person who also needed support. A person who deserved to be noticed. It was the first large sum of money I had ever held in my hands, and it seemed impossible. I didn't immediately say thank you to my grandmother. I just took the envelope and felt its weight fill me with a strange strength. It wasn't just money. It was a sign that I mattered. I was not just a shadow of my sister, not just a part of something else, not just what was left when something had already been taken. My grandmother smiled at me, and her smile was like a quiet light in a foggy room. She always knew how to give such moments, quiet, but bright, full of significance. I left the kitchen with the envelope, and I wanted to run, but I didn't know where. It was like a revelation. Suddenly, I understood that I didn't have to be anyone's shadow. I didn't have to live in the light of someone else's things. I could have something of my own. And it was such a simple, yet profound discovery. I didn't know what to do with the money, what to buy. It was a moment of freedom, but also a strange embarrassment. Because everything I had gotten before had already been experienced by someone else. Someone else had already made the decision for me. But now I could choose. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't so easy to have something of my own. It was a whole life that was hidden behind this moment. Preston was one of those fancy private colleges where tuition likely cost more than most people's homes. I knew that for my parents, it wasn't just a decision, but a huge sacrifice. We had been saving for it since Samantha was born, putting aside a little every month. Mom always said that for our girl, nothing was too good, and Dad, proudly adding, she deserves it. But still, when I looked at their faces, I could see how hard this decision was for them. In their eyes, there was anxiety, concern, as if they were both happy for Samantha and worried about me. And then, on the day when the talk of Preston became part of our family life, my grandmother rose and, as always, with just a glance, managed to change everything. I felt her eyes glide over my parents, as if reading every detail of their behavior, every subtle note in their voices. And when she spoke, her words hung in the air, sharply breaking the silence, which in that moment was so heavy it could have been cut with a knife. "This is wonderful news," she said, and her voice rang clear, sharp, like a bell. "I'm very happy for Samantha, but I must ask, have you allocated the same amount for Audrey's college tuition?" My parents were caught off guard, as if I had suddenly appeared in the center of the stage, and all eyes turned to me. I saw their faces go pale, and then Mom, trying to hide her embarrassment, clenched her hands on her knees and fell silent. The silence in the room became even more oppressive. It was the same kind of silence that is hard to endure, because it presses on your chest, making you feel unnecessary, insignificant. Mom, caught in the headlights, slowly lifted her eyes as if she had found the strength to speak. But the words she said didn't comfort me. On the contrary, they were as empty as what lay behind her gaze. "Well," she said, stumbling, "there's still plenty of time, Audrey. Preston, we'll think about how to make it possible. There's time." I knew it was a lie. Time wasn't endless. I had long understood that my place in the family was in question, that I was something that could be postponed, like an old thing that was no longer useful. The words, "there's plenty of time," meant nothing to me but a trite phrase adults say when they don't want to tell the truth. Grandmother didn't let go of their gaze. She stood in the center of the room, her eyes continuing to pierce through them as if she were reading their souls. When she didn't see an answer in their eyes, her face became as hard as stone, but her voice remained soft as silk. "Audrey," she said, "you don't have to wait until they decide whether you should go to college. You deserve the same as Samantha. You shouldn't be in the shadow, you shouldn't be second." Mom jumped to her feet, her face reddening, and Dad nervously started talking about something off-topic, which was unusual for him. I felt the world spinning around me, their eyes flickering from grandmother to me, and then back down to the floor. They were trying to find some excuse, but I knew that excuse didn't exist. All I could see were their embarrassed faces and the despair they couldn't hide. Grandmother didn't leave them in peace. "I'm not saying you have to do this right now," she continued. "But you have to understand that her opportunities aren't something you can put off. Audrey deserves better too." Dad, standing by the window, looked at us with a forlorn expression, and I saw regret flash in his eyes. I didn't know what exactly he regretted, whether it was that we couldn't afford all those luxurious things, or that I would never be the one they truly noticed. But at that moment, amidst all the silent glances and unclear words, I suddenly felt like grandmother had taken my side. And it was like a light at the end of a tunnel. Not as encouragement, but as a firm, confident decision. She saw me. She saw that I was here, with them, and that I wasn't just the one who stayed in the shadows, the one who deserved only second-hand things and half-forgotten care. Grandmother saw that I was a person too, and that I could have my dreams. And though, in that moment, everything was still as cloudy and uncertain as before, I felt something new inside me. Mom and Dad acted as if I had personally orchestrated the whole scene, as if I had somehow manipulated grandmother into exposing their favoritism. I saw how they couldn't meet grandmother's gaze, how their faces became frozen, and their movements seemed automatic. Samantha packed her things and went to Preston University that fall, taking all the warmth and conversations from our home with her. It was as if, with her, everything that made a home disappeared, and the air became empty and cold. We all understood that this was her moment, her time, and we should be happy for her. But there was something unfair about it. My parents walked around like ghosts, barely acknowledging my existence. I became invisible in their eyes, as if I didn't exist, had never existed. Sometimes I caught their gazes on me. A mix of hurt and embarrassment, as if I were the physical embodiment of their public humiliation. I didn't know how to shake off that feeling, and it settled on me somehow, suffocating me. Mom tried to hide her discontent, but I could see how she worried for Samantha. Sometimes she would sit in silence, staring at one spot, as if thinking about how she would live without everything revolving around her older daughter. Dad was quieter too, as if his nervous system had been overloaded, and now he just existed, not allowing himself to truly live. We all existed, but in different ways. I continued working at the cafe, continued getting good grades in school, continued existing in that empty house. I did all the usual things, without any illusions that things would change if I just waited. Sometimes, at night, when the house was empty and I was alone, it felt as if I wasn't really living, just existing, like an immobile shadow. I was angry at myself for it, for not being able to get out of that state, for not being able to find my way among all these words and looks, amid that emptiness that was growing around me. 2 years passed like this. When I finished high school, I was accepted into state university. It wasn't Preston, just a good school, but to me, it was a ticket upward, a chance for something more, a chance to become someone. I remember how grandmother beamed with pride when I showed her the acceptance letter. It was one of the few moments when I saw real happiness in her eyes, when she was proud of me, not someone else. Grandmother never said much, but her gaze was everything I needed. My parents were there for that moment, but they were silent. Mom still avoided looking at me, and Dad just sat there, not noticing me, as if the fact that I got into university didn't matter to him. Just like everything I had done before, like all my achievements. It wasn't that they didn't love me. No. It was like a quiet, but continuous distancing, like a thin veil between us, which I tried to tear, but couldn't. I didn't fully understand what this university meant to me. Was it just my step toward freedom? Or was I simply trying to prove to myself that I could be more than just an empty space in this house? After graduating from State University, I landed a great job at a marketing firm. This was my first real achievement, and at last, I felt that all those years of hard work, constant sacrifices, and giving up everything for my education were finally starting to pay off. I had my own small but cozy apartment, a good salary, and most importantly, complete independence from my parents. I could plan my life, make my own choices, and not worry about what would happen if I suddenly didn't meet someone else's expectations. Life was going pretty well. I was building my career, making decisions, and feeling like I was finally gaining confidence in myself. But everything changed when Samantha's wedding came. My parents outdid themselves once again, organizing a grand celebration that seemed like something extraordinary. The wedding appeared to be designed to set a new standard for luxury. The venue was a historic mansion, with perfectly trimmed rose bushes growing in the gardens, and chairs set up for guests against the backdrop of their blooming branches. A string quartet performed at the ceremony, and their music echoed in the air, creating an atmosphere not just of a fairy tale, but of an entire world where everyone, big or small, was meant to feel important and significant. The reception continued in the same exquisite style, tables filled with gourmet dishes, all carefully thought out to the last detail. 5 courses for dinner, wine, desserts, and ice sculpture that shimmered under the chandeliers, as if all of it existed for just one perfect day in Samantha's life. Perfect down to the smallest detail. It seemed to me that this day wasn't just a moment of happiness, but a ritual, where every glance and every gesture had to be flawless. Later, I learned that my parents had taken out a $200,000 loan to cover all the wedding expenses. It was something incredible. We all spoke of it in hushed whispers, but no one wanted to discuss it openly. Be that as it may, they made their choice. I stayed silent. What could I say? It wasn't my business how they spent their money, though inside I was boiling with irritation that I tried to hide. At the wedding, I was just one of many guests. I showed up, smiled for the photos, offered a few congratulatory words, trying to seem sincere, even though I couldn't fully share in their joy. I was genuinely happy for Samantha. But something about this celebration, about the endless magnificence, unsettled me. It was too bright, too loud, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done so much for her as for their own ambitions. For what? To show that they could give her everything. To show the world that she deserved only the best. But what was in it for me? I let myself believe that things were finally changing. Perhaps grandmother's intervention in our lives, her silent presence in our conversations, her looks, maybe all of this was finally making a difference. Maybe they had realized how unfairly they had treated me all this time. I hoped that this day, this wedding, would be the moment when everything would fall into place. I even let myself dream that, perhaps, my parents would finally start looking at me differently, that maybe in their eyes, I would finally become important. The day of the wedding was everything I could have dreamed of. The venue was an amazing lakeside resort, where the ceremony took place right by the water. Green grass stretched out around it, and beyond that, the lake's surface gleamed like a giant mirror. The flowers were perfect, white roses, peonies, with a subtle scent that created an atmosphere of magic. The food was exquisite, tables overflowing with gourmet treats, and every guest could enjoy not only the taste but also the sight, as each dish was served with artistry. And most importantly, everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. Even my parents looked truly happy. They were talking to guests, laughing, glowing with what seemed like genuine pride. Their eldest daughter was finally starting a new chapter in her life. And of course, I couldn't help but notice how, on this day, my parents were entirely focused on Samantha. But instead of feeling resentment, I tried to catch their happiness. Samantha was the center of attention at this celebration, and in that moment, it seemed like I had found my role, the role of a quiet observer, someone who was present but not too noticeable. Samantha took all the attention, but I didn't feel anger. On the contrary, I was grateful to be allowed to be part of it, even if only in a secondary role. In the midst of the reception, grandmother, as always, found me. Her eyes were sparkling, and she came over and gave me a tight hug, as if passing on her warmth, which could never be too much for any of us. This was her moment, and she didn't want me to feel forgotten. "This is exactly what you deserve, dear," she said, her voice soft but full of strength. "I'm so happy that your parents have finally done right by you. You deserve all this happiness." Grandmother's words were like a fire, warming me from the inside. I clung to her, feeling her strength and wisdom, and in that moment, I could breathe easier. She, as always, understood what I was feeling, and her words gave me what no one else's approval could, confirmation that I wasn't invisible, that I was important, that I had the right to everything good that happened in my life. She kissed me on the cheek, then stepped back a bit and said, "You've earned this day, dear. Don't forget that." And it was then, despite all the contradictions and old resentments, that I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just Samantha's wedding day, it was the day when I realized that, perhaps even amid all these complicated relationships, I still had my place. That despite all the years in the shadows, I deserved joy, respect, and love, not just from grandmother, but from my parents too. And I kept watching as Samantha, glowing and happy, received her congratulations. Everything in this world seemed to be in its place, although I knew that inside me there was still an unfinished healing process. I was on my way, and this was just the beginning. I felt so proud of them for finally treating me well. It seemed like everything was coming full circle, as if I had finally become a part of their world, a part of their joy. But it was hard for me to express these feelings. I couldn't. I was unable to tell grandmother what had really happened that night when they threw that extravagant celebration for Samantha. I lay awake, thinking about all the signs I had long ignored. Suddenly, I realized how persistently they had tried to throw an expensive wedding for their eldest daughter, how they immediately dismissed my modest budget, how they unhesitatingly chose luxury for her and ignored my small successes and achievements. I wanted so badly to believe that they had changed, that I had fallen into their trap, that they were truly beginning to appreciate me. But it turned out that life only seemed to be improving. Almost immediately after I started thinking that maybe everything was finally getting better, that I was beginning to see myself in a place where I could be happy, Patricia showed up at our house. Everything changed at that moment. One Sunday afternoon, she walked through the door without any warning, as if by right, just as always. She stood there with her signature bright smile, the one no one could resist. In one hand, she held a fruit pie that appeared to have been made just to make sure no one would like it, and in the other, some sort of cane that made her figure seem even more arrogantly imposing. "Audrey, darling," she called out sharply, pushing past me into the living room. "It's been so long. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by to see how your married life is going." Her words sounded as if she were the most important figure in the world, and I was merely an actress playing my role in her play. She always knew how to act as though the whole world had been made around her. And I stood frozen in my place, not knowing how to react. Everything I had dreamed of, those moments of calm when life would finally settle into its alternating rhythm, was suddenly shattered again. Patricia, like a whirlwind, swept away that little fragile harmony that seemed to have begun forming in my life. Her appearance, as always, had its flavor, a mixture of irritating superiority and an insincere care that could never be real. With every word she spoke, I felt as though she was invading my space, my life, even at that moment when I wasn't ready for her intrusion. I sat, staring at my phone for hours, reading and rereading my mother's comment as if each element of it were some kind of ominous code I was trying to decipher, even though I knew it would just hurt. Every word felt like a knife wound, especially the comparisons she drew between Samantha and me, which she tacked on at the end, as if underscoring how much they had underestimated me and how much more they still needed to do for me to feel like I was truly a part of their world. And it was too much. In that moment, something inside me snapped so badly that I said aloud, scaring James, who was working nearby. I didn't know how else to express what I had been holding in. I'm not going to be the bad guy in their story anymore. My hands were shaking as I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the check I had once written to my parents. It was a check for $100,000, the amount I had given them when they told me they couldn't cover their share of Samantha's wedding. At that moment, I decided that this would be my contribution to their happiness, that I couldn't leave them without support, despite everything that had happened between us. I took a photo of the check, making sure the amount was clearly visible in the shot, as if this image was my new proof of something I had been hiding from myself all along. Then I started typing. No, not just to explain things to them. This wasn't an explanation, it was my confession, which I could have just sent, but instead, I decided to write it because I felt like I needed to voice the truth. Let everyone know. Let Mom and Dad see. Yes, they threw me a beautiful wedding. But no, I didn't ask for that. Actually, I had planned a modest celebration with a $25,000 budget, which I was going to pay for myself. I never wanted everything to look like an exhibition of their grandeur, like it was supposed to be their contribution to my life. No, I didn't ask for their help. I didn't ask them to show how much they could spend just to look good in the eyes of others. I didn't need that. I never asked them to feel this debt they supposedly owed me. I never asked for anything more. But they interfered. They made all the decisions for me, as always. And now, after everything is over, they want their credit. It's important to remember that they always do this, intervene when they want to, and expect gratitude. But when I asked for fairness, when I simply asked to be noticed, that didn't happen. My fingers moved across the keys, not allowing myself to stop. I had to speak out. I had to tell how things really were. Because for all these years, it felt like I was playing the role of a secondary character in their family. It seemed like I didn't exist until Samantha came along. And now, when I was beginning to build my own life, my own relationships, my own story, I wasn't allowed to forget how they saw me. My parents didn't think about what I felt. They didn't think I deserved to be important. I was typing the text, and each word brought relief, as if I could finally take control of my own story instead of continuing to be just a spectator in someone else's drama. The text on the screen became clearer and more confident. I couldn't stop. Everything I had kept silent about, everything I had held inside, had to be said. I knew I couldn't go back. Once I took a step toward the truth, there would be no turning back. I was preparing dinner when someone started pounding on the door. It was loud, insistent, as though someone was trying to break something fragile. James was at work, staying late, and I was alone in the house, absorbed in chopping vegetables, when suddenly the knocking threw me into a state of tension. I didn't even have time to figure out who could be at the door. Gripping the spoon in my hand, I approached the door, opened it, and found my mother standing there. Her face was red with fury, her eyes were burning, and she literally stormed in like a storm. "How dare you?" she screamed, pushing past me into the house as though I were the obstacle preventing her from getting to the truth. She threw her words like weapons, and each of her jabs was sharp and merciless. "How dare you go running to your grandmother with your lies?" I stood there, rooted to the spot, not knowing what to say. It was one of those moments when I felt vulnerable, yet at the same time, I was determined not to back down. Keeping my voice steady, I replied, "I didn't lie about anything. You sent me a bill, I paid it. And when you tried to make me look bad, I showed everyone the truth." "You ruined everything," I said, not letting her overshadow my thoughts. She was in a near hysterical state, and despite her fury, I wasn't going to give in. She kept shouting, her words coming out with such force that it seemed like she was about to destroy everything around her. "Now your grandmother changed because of you. Do you even realize what you've done? You're the reason your father and I hardly get anything, and she's leaving you almost everything." Her voice echoed through the house, shaking the space around us. I could hear her breathing becoming shallow, her throat tightening with nerves. She couldn't stop, the words spilled out like a flood, not giving her any chance to catch her breath. "Her savings, Audrey. All her savings. Samantha gets everything, and your father and I get nothing, and it's all your fault." I stood there, unable to immediately process what had happened. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced, trying to process the information. Mom kept talking, but her words were becoming less and less clear, as if I had been swept into the vortex of her emotions, and she couldn't stop. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just an accusation. It was an accusation that I had violated something bigger than just family relations. She was pointing at me as the cause of everything, as if I alone were responsible for her disappointments and for what she felt as a loss. Samantha, who could now take everything that didn't concern me and keep everything that mattered, and I stood at the center of this storm like a bystander who couldn't leave. "You think this is your fault?" I finally broke the silence. My voice sounded like a stone hitting still water. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to say, but inside me, there was a raging fury, and I couldn't leave it unanswered. "You think I'm to blame for Grandma giving me her money? You think I asked her to leave it to me?" Mom fell silent, and for a moment, her eyes darkened. She hadn't expected an answer from me that didn't suit her, and perhaps I surprised her, maybe even shocked her. But in that moment, I couldn't let this shadow go unanswered. Several days passed since my mother stormed into the house. Her words still echoed in my mind like a broken record, but I could no longer allow myself to hold on to old wounds. I returned to my usual routine, but something inside me had shifted. I felt that it was time to change something. A transformation was taking place inside me that I might not have understood without that violent clash with reality. I stood in front of the mirror, examining my reflection. My face, still showing traces of yesterday's exhaustion, now reflected resolve. I decided that I would no longer fight for a place in this world, no longer beg for recognition from those who didn't value me. I understood that my whole life, all the ambitions I had kept buried deep inside, could not depend on others. And if they didn't understand who I was, that was no longer my problem. I took a decisive step, perhaps the most important one of my life. I sent my parents a letter, not the one I thought I should have written many years ago, but the one that spoke of my true feelings. I told them that I wouldn't be who I am without my own efforts, not what they had once imposed on me. I told them how painful it was to see my achievements always in the background, while their love and recognition were always meant for Samantha. And despite all of this, I decided to let them go. After sending the letter, I felt the weight lift from me. I no longer longed for their approval, no longer waited for justification. I was ready to be myself. One evening, as I sat in a cozy chair drinking tea, James approached me. We were silent for a few minutes, but I knew he was waiting for me to finally open up. I met his gaze and said, "I'm not going to be part of this game anymore, James. I should have done this a long time ago." He nodded without saying a word. He knew what I was talking about. He knew that this wasn't just about my parents, but about how I had learned to let go of the past in order to move forward. That night, I once again felt that life could be something entirely different. I made decisions that once seemed impossible, and freed myself from the shackles of the past. My relationships with my parents, with my sister, they no longer dictated who I was. I became myself. And that was my true liberation. Several weeks passed, and, as strange as it may sound, I received a message from my mother. She wrote that, despite all our disagreements, she still loved me. And I suppose I felt something like relief, but it no longer meant as much to me as it once had. My happiness no longer depended on their approval. At Samantha's wedding, I felt like an outsider. I was no longer part of that world that had once oppressed me. And even though everything was as luxurious as before, I was no longer the one who craved recognition in the eyes of others. At that moment, I realized that I had stopped being their forgotten child. I was myself, Audrey, and that was enough.